Today, we are going to take a look at one of the earliest forms of media and censorship and how far back that goes. Comic books. Stick around. Welcome back to another episode of Just a Tip with Dr. Vic / Sex Nerd Podcast. My name is Dr. Victoria Hartman, and today we're going to take on a topic that I actually never thought I would take on. However, over the course of the past few months, I have been reacquainting myself with comic book art, in particular, explicit comic book art. Now, for those of you who might be a Gen Xer, maybe it goes back further than Gen X, I don't know. But as a Gen Xer, comic books, D&D, all these kinds of things were a big deal when we were in our late teens and early 20s. And for some of us, we collected this stuff, it got put away in a box, and then you start cleaning up your house, or someone new comes into your life and says, hey, what about comic books? And you go, So I've been doing a little bit of collecting of comic books of late, and I decided to look into what the history of censorship is around comic books. And the reason that I wanted to do that is I was recently made aware that there are particular series of comic books that not only are no longer in production, but because of anti-censorship efforts, getting a hold of these comic books is nearly impossible. And I've actually spent the last couple of weeks looking for a particular series that I won't mention here because I don't want to get a strike or any kind of YouTube violations, especially as I'm sure you know the recent controversy around censorship and demonetization and so forth. That's kind of been making those conversations been making their rounds on YouTube. However, I'm aware of a few series of comic books that I've made every effort to buy, and you just cannot find them. You can't find them to buy them, or if you do, they're incredibly expensive because the actual publisher is out of business. So I thought to myself, okay, this is interesting. And why it's interesting to me is the parallels between comic book censorship, and adult content censorship, which is something that I have an expertise in. I'm an expert pornography evaluator and forensic researcher. So it occurred to me that there are some parallels here, and I wanted to dive deeper. So I started looking into the history of comic books, and not just explicit ones, comic books in general. There's way too much information to cover in one podcast. So maybe I'll make this a series. I don't know. However, I thought it was the parallels between the adult film industry and adult content and the comic book industry are so similar. I was taken aback. So let's start back in the 1930s. Now, some of you might not be familiar with there are these little drawn flip books. They're called Tijuana Bibles. And these were really popular, I believe, during the Second World War and passed around by soldiers. We have several in the museum. And beyond that, Second World War type stuff, the museum itself hasn't really looked into the history of comic book banning. Well, this goes back to at least the 30s, and comic books have been considered low value speech, and as a result, stigmatized. Now, moral crusaders asserted that comics corrupted the youth, hurt their ability to read and appreciate art, and even made them delinquents. This kind of public criticism spread in popular magazines and town meetings and even led to public book burnings of comic books. Youth groups rallied to completely rid some towns of comics, buying up every comic in their local areas to be burned. Now, think about this for a minute. Comic books were burned in the United States at the same time as book burnings, roughly, were happening in wartime Germany. In the 1940s, comic book burnings were happening in the US, even as GIs were returning home from seeing the same activities in Germany. Although comics were associated primarily with juvenile readers, a full 25% of the printed materials going to the military in World War II were comics. Sterling North's anti-comics editorial, A National Disgrace, appeared in the Chicago Daily News in 1940. It was reprinted in multiple newspapers throughout the United States and included such quotes as, "Badly drawn, badly written, and badly printed, a strain on young eyes and young nervous systems. Their crude blacks and reds spoil the child's natural sense of color. The hypodermic injection of sex and murder make the child impatient with better, though quieter, stories." Now, there was an effort by several individuals who formed the ACMP, or the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers, to help curb the public criticism. They developed a code that banned depictions sympathetic to criminals, scenes of sadistic torture, the humorous or glamorous depiction of divorce, foul language, or ridicule or attack on religious or racial groups. Now, they failed due to a lack of uniform participation and standards for reviewing comics, and the public criticism continued. Now, as time went on, the comic book industry was faced with an angry public and the threat of regulation by the government or self-regulation. The comics industry was backed into a corner at this point. So they established this Comic Magazine Association of America, which instituted a Comics Code Authority, a censorship code that thoroughly sanitized the content of comics for years to come. Almost overnight, comics were brought down to a level appropriate only for the youngest and dimmest of readers. I'm not gonna necessarily agree with the dimmest, but definitely the youngest. Horror, crime, science fiction, and other genres appealing to older and more sophisticated readers were wiped out for a generation. Now, here are some of the aspects of the Comics Code. And this is so reminiscent of Miller v. California, which impacted the adult industry heavily in the 1970s. And lo and behold, it did the comic book industry as well. However, that wasn't until the 70s. This was prior to that. Comic Code. Crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. If a crime is depicted, it shall be as sordid. If a crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, gory and gruesome crimes shall be eliminated. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. So don't have any BDSM in your comic books. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols that have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden. Undesirable meanings? Who gets to interpret that? Who gets to decide what's undesirable? Anyway, I'll continue. Nudity in any form is prohibited, as is indecent or undue exposure. Suggestive and salacious illustrations or suggestive posture is unacceptable. Suggestive, salacious. You could be in a suggestive or salacious pose with clothes on, wielding a sword if you're standing the right way in an illustration. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration in any physical qualities. Illicit sex relations are neither to be hinted at nor portrayed. Rape scenes as well as sexual abnormalities are unacceptable. I would really love to know, as someone who specializes in paraphilias, what they consider a sexual abnormality. Seduction and rape shall never be shown or suggested. Seduction? Sex perversion or any inference to same is strictly forbidden. Okay, they've now used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and now the 8th one, all about sex. Nudity with meretricious purpose or salacious posture shall not be permitted in the advertising of any product. Clothed figures shall never be presented in such a way as to be offensive or contrary to good taste or morals. Wow, that sounds really familiar across just about every medium you can think of, from music to pornography to any sort of foreign illustrations, art, digital art. Now, there were Senate hearings as well, and these left an impression on the public, and the subsequent censorship of the code decimated the comics industry. Individual creators who'd made their careers writing or illustrating comics now lied about their profession in polite company because admitting to working in comics was viewed as a calling so deviant that it was, well, aligned with being a fringe pornographer. Now, as a result of this code and these Senate hearings, there were scores of legislation, hundreds of acts of legislation that were introduced on the state and municipal levels to ban or limit the sale of comics. The most egregious censorship bill was in New York, no less. That served to prohibit the publication and the distribution of lurid comics defined as those devoted to or principally made up of pictures or accounts of methods of crime or illicit sex, horror, terror, physical torture, brutality, or physical violence. Bar the sale of any such books to those under the age of 18. Ban the use of the words crime, terror, horror, or sex in comic book titles. By the fall of 1955, bills on comic books had passed the legislative bodies of California, Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, Montana, Nevada, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, and Washington. Legislation was proposed and either voted down or not acted upon in Delaware, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, New Mexico, South Dakota, Utah, and Wisconsin. The Senate subcommittee hearings, the Comics Code, and the subsequent flurry of laws regulating the sale of comics combined to form the most brutal era of censorship arising from moral panic that American pop culture has ever known. Maybe by 1955, but we saw it again in 1970-ish. Let's continue. Now, as you can imagine, comic book creators went underground for a significant amount of time. until around the 1970s, 71 in particular, when the mainstream starts to fight censorship codes. While the undergrounds were speaking to the spirit of an era and in the process creating a dynamic where artists called their own shots, mainstream comics were also coming to grips with the world around them. Marvel Comics had become a phenomenon that achieved popularity among all kinds of youth audiences, including the then unheard of readership of college students. The multifaceted heroes and their equally compelling foes resonated with audiences to the tune of sales that reached 50 million comics sold in 1968. In 1971, the Nixon administration Department of Health, Education and Welfare took note of Marvel's popularity and contacted the editor-in-chief, Stan Lee, to request he create a comic book story about drug abuse. Now, any depiction of drug use is still forbidden by the Comics Code, which didn't deter Lee from honoring his government's requests. He wrote a three-part arc in The Amazing Spider-Man number 96 through 98, which portrayed Peter Parker's friend Harry Osborn as being hospitalized after an acid trip. Marvel asked the CMAA for permission to publish the special issues, and it was turned down. Marvel published the comics anyway, running them without the Comic Code seal of approval. The absence of the seal did not harm sales. Now, for a while, in the 70s, there was a small explosion of comic magazines without the interference of the Comics Code until, well, and that also included National Lampoon from 1971 to 75, 1977 Heavy Metal. Let's see. Heavy Metal brought the then new wave of European illustrators such as Mobius, Guido Krapax, Enki Bilal, and H.R. Geiger into a space that made room for American legends Richard Corbin, Arthur Sudum, Bernie Wrightson, and others to produce an anthology that would challenge established wisdom about what's possible in storytelling and illustration. And then we get to 1973, so 1977, we're going to backtrack a little bit, to the obscenity test. For those of you who know anything about adult material, this was a pivotal moment in law. In June 1973, 3 months after the New York State Court of Appeals upheld the conviction of Zap 4, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark decision that would once and for all define what was obscene. In Miller v. California, the Supreme Court created a three-pronged test to determine what is obscene. In what is commonly referred to as the Miller test, which still applies to this day to some degree, the court stated, it's been challenged a number of times, the court stated that states can regulate material as obscene if it meets all three of the following prongs. Whether the person, the average person, applying contemporary community standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law, and whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. After Miller v. California, content businesses all over the country braced for combat. The Miller test gave local jurisdictions the ability to determine what was obscene, causing many businesses to pull their content from their shelves as they feared they could be found objectionable. The Miller decision proved to be a fatal blow to underground comics. Comics were largely distributed by head shops that specialized in counterculture goods, including drug paraphernalia. In many jurisdictions, head shops were vulnerable under local paraphernalia laws, or at least found themselves being subjected to police scrutiny and intimidation. If the local community was now determining what was obscene, and if New York City, of all places, had decided that Zap, the movement's high water mark, was obscene there, what chance did a shop in a less liberal locality have? Many of the dealers who carried the material decided it was too risky to continue supporting. The comics movement went into a free fall, and the movement soon ended. This time, the dealers who sold underground comics stopped buying them out of a sense of self-preservation in the face of new obscenity standard that threatened not just their business, but their very freedom. The tide of censorship had turned from publishers to the retailer. So now we get into some equivalencies that we saw between the adult film industry and the comic book industry where creators are concerned. Now, many of you know that individuals such as the grand patron of my museum, Harry Mooney, Larry Flint, etc., were brought to trial, prosecuted, penalized for their First Amendment rights. And the law used a number of different tactics. Since it couldn't go First Amendment necessarily, there were things like tax evasion, etc. There are other ways in which they got around obscenity laws. It would appear that, or civil lawsuits, it would appear that in the comic book world, the same thing happened and has continued to happen since the 70s. It also continues where books, book publishers, private publishers, etc., are concerned. Now, this is, I'm just learning of this individual. Underground cartoonist Mike Diana was the first American artist ever to be convicted of obscenity charges and prohibited from making art. His work flows from an underground comics tradition harkening back to Rory Hayes, Greg Irons, and S. Clay Wilson's deployment of grotesque figures to produce graphic and often shocking comments on some of society's most serious problems. Diana was set up in a mail sting against his comics zine, Boiled Angel. For 3 years, he fought for his life and lost. Diana's punishment prevented him from drawing in his own home, and he was subject to spot checks to verify he wasn't doing so. Diana's case remains one of the most severe miscarriages of justice in the history of American art jurisprudence. After a week-long case in March of 1994, a Florida jury found Diana guilty of publishing, distributing, and advertising obscene material. They agreed that his work lacked serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific value because it did not compare with such works as The Grapes of Wrath or Picasso's Guernica. Diana described, he was taken from the courthouse to prison where he waited 4 days to be sentenced. He faced the prospect of 3 years in prison. He was ultimately sentenced to a 3-year probationary period, during which time his residence was subject to inspection with or without warrant to determine if he was in possession of or is creating obscene material. He was to have no contact with children under the age of 18, undergo psychological testing, enroll in a journalistic ethics course, and pay a $3,000 fine, plus perform 1,248 hours of community service. 2 appeals, the state appellate court failed. The courts refused to accept an amicus brief submitted by the ACLU and responded without comment to the second and final appeal. In May of 1997, the CBLDF and the ACLU submitted a petition to the U.S. Supreme Court to hear Diana's case. George Raydart, a well-known First Amendment attorney, assisted in preparing the petition. The Supreme Court denied the petition without comment, thereby ending all possibility of overturning Diana's conviction. States themselves have gone after comic book creators and publishers. Oklahoma City destroyed Planet Comics. Texas prosecuted manga. South Carolina went after offensive comics that came in via customs. Georgia battled to ban naked Picasso in 2004. Now we come to a bit more modern times. Let's start in 2003. Prosecutors, customs agents, and other law enforcement are targeting comics in print and online, most especially manga. In recent years, CBLDF, which is the comic book agencies, or the agency for comic books, that is the equivalent to the Free Speech Coalition for the adult film industry. They have aided in increase in cases involving readers wrongly accused of possession of obscene material and child pornography as a result of constitutionally protected comic book images in their possession. This abrupt sea change in prosecution emerges from the passing of the PROTECT Act in 2003. PROTECT is a sweeping anti-child pornography law that expanded prosecutorial remedies to punish child sex offenses. Unfortunately, the law also created a new crime: producing, receiving, possessing, or manufacturing obscene child pornography of a non-photographic nature. While much of the PROTECT Act deals with protecting actual victims, there are several provisions that ban imaginative depictions in cartoons, paintings, sculpture, and other art forms. The difficulty with these provisions is that they don't protect victims of actual crimes, but instead criminalize speech. They also carry mandatory minimum sentences, which has led to at least one case where a guilty plea was forced in a case that could have prevailed. Now, there continue to be prosecutions under this law and similar that have been passed since then. Sesta Fosta is the more modern version of that. And I was actually invited to testify as an adult content expert or a pornography expert in a case in Texas, I think a year or two ago. And I opted not to participate because the court did not provide an option for a virtual testimony. And this was at the height of the COVID pandemic. And so I opted not to participate simply because for health reasons. And my understanding is the individual who, if I'm not mistaken, wrote, so these were literary pieces, wrote obscene materials that were in violation of the PROTECT Act and Sesta Fosta, I believe, and was found guilty. Now, there are several cases that were cited here: the U.S. versus Horley, the U.S. versus Handley, the R versus Matheson. In 2010, Ryan Matheson, a 25-year-old American citizen, computer programmer, and manga fan, was unlawfully arrested by Canadian authorities. He was wrongfully accused of possessing and importing child pornography because of constitutionally protected manga on his laptop before he was let into the country. Apparently, there was severe abuse. They did not inform him of the reason for his detention. His property was illegally searched. He suffered cruel and unusual punishment. He was denied food and blankets. And apparently, police transporting him to prison actually said, if you are assaulted here, it doesn't count. He had no criminal record and was not in possession of any photographic material. The image, one that's in front of me here, are cartoon depictions of various positions, sexual positions. And the other one is a fan-made comic depicting a fantasy scenario between non-human characters. Now, the organization that is similar to the Free Speech Coalition in the comic book world aided Ryan's defense, which included expert testimony about the artistic merit of manga, the fact that the material he is accused of possessing is protected speech in his home country in the US, and that the material is accepted in its origin country of Japan. As a result of that defense, the Canadian government dropped all charges against Ryan earlier in 2021. It would appear there are countless similarities between censorship in the comic book world and censorship censorship that affects the adult industry, or any kind of subversive, non-mainstream content, media, digital art, comic book drawn art, adult content such as pornography. I am stunned by the similarities that have been experienced by the comic book world as well as the adult film world. And I think it all comes back to one source, and that is the desire of certain groups, governments, religious organizations to stifle the expression, and apparently not just the sexual expression, but the expression of any subversive thought in artistic form. This applies to art installations as well. There have been museums where art has been defaced, destroyed, because it offended someone. I could go into a long speech about offense and the responsibility of the individual who's offended rather than those who offend. But I'd be talking for another 2 hours. I admit I'm at a loss for words as to solutions. This doesn't seem like it's going to end. It is going to be a constant, ongoing, long-term battle between those who would want to silence art and artists and the depictions of that which they find offensive or subversive, and the people who continue to create it and advocate for free speech. I'm not going to get into any conversations about hate speech, or we're talking about art here. Art and the drawn, written, digitally created, painted, photographed. I'm absolutely stunned by what the comic book industry has gone through and continues to go through. And having educated myself now on this, I'm not surprised that the comic books that I have been looking for are not available, and that collectors are holding on to them. So one thing this has done is it has motivated me to consider doing an exhibit at the museum covering this history and including some subversive comic book art. That's something we don't have at the museum yet, and I think it's missing, and it needs to be. We need to make a priority to have that included in our museum. So I am contemplative today, as you might be able to tell. Well, all I can suggest at this point is if you have a subversive comic book, hold on to it and keep it in its plastic wrap. Don't let it get destroyed, because it has a greater meaning and greater importance than just entertainment. It's a representation of an artist's moment to speak and draw and create as freely as they could in that moment. And I think that's pretty much a good way to wrap this up. Thank you once again for joining me right here on Sex Nerd Podcast and Just a Tip with Dr. Vic. And I will see you next time. Bye.